Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, you're going to have part 1 of my SCASL project. There are going to be 4 total parts. In each part of the project, I'm going to talk about 10 different books. There are 20 books for the young adult list and 20 books for the middle grades list. Now, in years past, there has been some overlap, but this year there are no overlaps, so that means 40 separate books. What I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to talk about a certain number of categories and criteria about the book, and then ultimately give them a ranking. At the end of the second part for each category, so the second part for young adult and the second part for middle grade, I will give the overall finalized ranking. I am recording these in batches, so I am not waiting until I've read all 20 books in each category. So there are going to be the possibilities of rankings shifting. So here are the criteria on which I'm going to talk about the SCASL books. First off, I'm going to give a brief overview of the book, as well as my personal thoughts about the book for myself as a reader. That's only one of the criteria that I'm going to talk about, because these books, this book award is geared towards students. Ultimately, the winners are chosen by the students themselves. The second criteria is going to be representation. I'm not going to judge or give a rating based on the representation. I'm simply going to describe the representation that is present or not present in each book. Third, I'm going to talk about the quality, by which I mean the teaching potential of each book. So thinking as an ELA teacher, would I use this book as a whole class novel or part of a book club? Fourth, I'm going to say whether or not I would purchase it to put it on my classroom shelves. And lastly, I'm going to give you my tentative rank out of the books that I have read thus far. So in this first part of the project, there are 3 books that I have read prior to starting this project. So I'm going to talk briefly about those books, and then I'm going to get into the books that I have read as part of the project. So the first book that I am going to talk about is Firekeeper's Daughter. I was so excited to see this on the list, and anyone who's watched my videos for a while knows how much I love this video. It takes a lot for me to tear up at a book, but at a certain point in this book, Angeline Booley got me. This book is set in the early 2000s, and the main character is a mixed race Caucasian and Ojibwe girl. She plays hockey. She lives in a hockey town, and she has to deal with trying to figure out where she fits in her circles, because she's not fully Ojibwe, she's not fully white. But on top of that, there is a drug epidemic that is wreaking havoc in this area. And it recently, a lot of people are speculating, cost the life of her uncle, with whom she was very close. And ultimately, she gets caught up in an investigation into other actions, deaths, things like that that have been going on. And it becomes like a thriller towards the end of it, but not what a lot of people would think of as a thriller. I gave this a rating of 5 stars. On the representation front, obviously you have Donis's Ojibwe heritage. As far as the quality and teaching potential, I would not use it as a whole class novel, but if I wanted to set up a book club teaching about plot and how to develop good plot and tracking the different parts of the plot, I would definitely include this as part of that, because you can very clearly see the different elements of typical plot structure in this book. When it comes to having on classroom shelves, I would definitely have it on the shelves. And then finally, my rank, as it should be obvious, it is actually tied for the #1 spot with the book that I will talk about next. The second book that I will talk about in this project is Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. Earlier this year, I read it for the second time, and this time I read it as an audiobook. So I've read it both physically and as an audiobook. I have loved and given 5 stars to all 3 of Elizabeth Acevedo's books that I have read. The only reason I'm not holding it up is because it is currently in my new classroom, packed up in a box. I already keep it on my classroom shelves. In Clap When You Land, it tells the story in verse of 2 Dominican sisters. But these sisters, they don't know that each other exists. During the school year, the one sister in New York has her father and her mother, a typical quote-unquote family structure. But then in the summer, every summer, her father goes home to the Dominican Republic for business and things like that. But what he's actually doing is he's going back to the Dominican to spend the summer with his other daughter. Now, this daughter is being raised by her grandmother because her mother died early on in her childhood. And the book starts with a very traumatic event, and that is the crashing of the plane that their father was riding to come back to the Dominican. And as the events unfold, these 2 sisters learn about each other and all of these secrets that their father, and it turns out other people in their life, have been keeping from them. It is a beautiful book. Elizabeth Acevedo's narrative voice in her poetry is gorgeous. So this book twice has earned 5 stars from me, both on my initial read and on my reread. As far as representation goes, there's obviously the Latinx representation. I cannot remember at the moment, but I believe that there is Afro-Latinx representation as well. And then this sister who lives in New York is in a committed relationship with another girl, so there is LGBT representation. As far as quality and or teaching potential, I would definitely consider this book if I were to use a whole class novel. For one, it's going to read quicker than a prose style novel because it's written in verse. And secondly, because of the character development and the revelations and the way that Elizabeth Acevedo creates these images, I think it would be an excellent novel to study the use of figurative language through. If I didn't use it as a whole class novel, I would definitely use it as part of a book club with the purpose of studying. It could be to study poetry, it could be the figurative language, things like that. This has high teaching potential. I would definitely keep this as a book on my classroom shelves. Obviously, it's there right now. And as far as rank, as I mentioned, it is tied with Firekeeper's Daughter for first place. The third book that I will talk about is the last book that I read prior to starting this project, and that is The Gilded Ones by Namina Forna. I read The Gilded Ones as part of my project through going through the Goodreads Choice Award nominees. In The Gilded Ones, you have a society which is extremely patriarchal. The value of a girl is based on her ability to marry and bear heirs. But before they are considered eligible to marry, there is a ceremony that they have to go through when they are 15 or 16. And that is when they check their blood. So that if the blood runs red, they are considered pure and marriageable. If the blood runs gold, they are considered an abomination and they are killed. And the main character in this book, she has always followed along with everything that society has told her, and she has internalized so much of this demeaning, top-down patriarchal culture talking about her worth. On top of that, when it comes time for this ceremony, for her ceremony and other girls around her age, there is an attack by something called death shrieks. In the attack, she is seen to somewhat control the death shrieks, but also she is injured, and it is seen that her blood runs gold. So immediately she is taken and she is killed. But she doesn't stay dead, because the thing about these girls whose blood runs gold, there's only one true death. And so there are graphic scenes, or at least descriptions, of all sorts of different torturous deaths that are inflicted upon the main character in hopes of finding her one true death and getting rid of her. But at a certain point, she is taken from her village to this training ground where there are girls like her who are being trained to be a specialized guard for the Emperor. They're still not treated well. They're not considered human. There's even more terrible things said about them and imposed on them. The main character's growth throughout this book is her coming to terms with what she is, what she can do, what is actually the truth, what is actually going on, and conquering what she has been taught all of her life. At the time that I read it, I rated it 4.25. I don't use quarter stars anymore, but in my eyes, this is slightly above a 4-star, but below a 4.5. As far as representation, you definitely have African representation. This is based on African culture. As far as the quality of the book and the teaching potential, I believe that this book was Nami Naforna's debut. And there were some ways that the plot unfolded that felt a little clunky, where I could tell what Nami Naforna was trying to do. It wasn't as smooth. The transitions between plot points didn't work sometimes. And the ending felt rushed. I have the arc of the sequel, which I intend to read, and we'll see how she expands on what she introduced at the end. But the whole last, say, 10-15% of the book felt rushed. Because this is a debut and because I can see the problems with some of the mechanics and the plot structure, I don't know that I would put this as a book in a book club, and I wouldn't teach from it. However, I would most definitely have this on my classroom shelves. However, in the political environment that we are in, it would be easy for someone to challenge this book, especially because it's, number one, talking about African culture. It's, number two, talking about basically overthrowing the patriarchy, and there is still a lot of, I'll just leave it at the fact that there's still a lot of that where people are reacting because they still want to hold on to power even though they are in the minority. And there's also the fact that it is a lot darker than a parent would necessarily want their child to see. It's not tasteless, it's not gratuitous, but for that, I would probably have, say, a book plate or something in there listing content warnings, but I would definitely keep it on my classroom shelves. The tentative rank for this right now is 3rd. The 2 first place books that I have, Firekeeper's Daughter and Clap When You Land, I don't see anything unseating them. Starting with the Gilded Ones, there is a possibility that it could be unseated just based on the different books coming through as we read them. Now, I will say the next 2 that I'm going to talk about do not unseat it. The first book that I read as part of this project, I read on audiobook, and that is This Is Not the Jess Show. I should have been able to guess from the image, the cover image, that it would be more like the Truman Show than what I actually expected. Because I read something in the synopsis about something meets Black Mirror, I expected it to be a little creepier, especially since at the beginning of the story, so many people are mysteriously falling ill to this flu, and it's like, oh no, what's happening? It turns out to be, if you're familiar with the Truman Show, it's a guy who is living his life in, I believe, the 60s, but it turns out that his entire life is a television show. And nothing is real, and it actually takes place in the late 90s. This is sort of a quote-unquote reboot of that, where Jess, the main character, she believes that she's living in 1998. And all of the pop culture references and everything like that relate to things that would be around in the late 90s. But then it turns out it's just a TV show. So it's an interesting premise that you could probably do a lot with. It was so unrealistic, stressed the suspension of disbelief way too much. It scoffed at it, especially as quote unquote, all these dangers and everything that the characters are facing gets revealed, I didn't buy it. And one of the things, so it's set about 12, 15 years in the future from now, in 2037. So some of the technology is not technology that we have now, but it's very similar to technology that we do have. Well, one of the big things that has to drive the plot is this mass, huge cultural obsession with this show. If you know anything about social media and the media that people consume, there is not one singular thing that can enthrall a nation or an entire city where every single person has seen this show. And that is the biggest thing that stressed my suspension of disbelief on this. Attention spans in today's society are so fractured, it's not reasonable to expect that every single person that Jess and the other character that she's running with would encounter would know about the show, would recognize them from this show. It's just not believable. Even if you think of pop culture hits now, there's going to be a large number of people who have no idea who we're talking about and could not recognize them. So for that reason, it seemed absurd to me. I didn't think it was relatable, and ultimately I rated it 2.5 stars. As far as representation goes, there's none. There's absolutely none. These are white, hetero characters. No representation at all. So that's not a mark in its favor. Quality and teaching potential, there's no. I would not use this as a book club book, definitely wouldn't do a whole class novel or anything like that. I don't think that kids, the current generation, would be into something set in the 90s, which a good portion of it feels like it is because it's just believing she lives in 1998. A lot of people would say, well, there's the obsession with Friends. Yes, that's true, but Friends started in the late 90s. I believe it started in 97 or 98. Most of Friends was in the early 2000s. And most of what I've seen from kids is that they're more obsessed with cultural things that were in the early 2000s. That being said, would I put it on my classroom shelves? If I stumbled across a free copy, maybe. There's nothing objectionable about it. And you know what? Maybe there's a kid who doesn't want anything serious. They just want a feel-good book. So I would put it on the shelf. So the tentative rank of the 5 books that I'll be talking about in this portion, I'll be talking about the other 5 in a moment. Tentative rank is 5. It's at the bottom. I don't foresee it staying at 5. I see it staying near the bottom. Maybe something is going to be lower than it. I hope not, because I want to enjoy what I'm reading, and I'm hoping that more quality books are going to be chosen, but it's not going to stay at 5. The 5th book that I'm going to talk about, I also read as an audiobook, and that is Charming as a Verb. From the get-go, you are introduced to Henry, who is a first-generation Haitian American. He talks a lot about how he charms people, how he's built his business. As I'm getting into it, I'm like, okay, I understand the title, but I don't see where we're going. It took a long time for something to happen where it's not just average, everyday high school kid life. And a lot of the book suffers from that. The characters themselves, I didn't grow attached to any of them. The fact that his best friend seems more like one of those sidekicks that they throw into rom-coms with no development whatsoever. I didn't like that. I mean, Ming, his best friend, cool guy and all, but I wish he had been in the first part of the book more. The development of the romance, I couldn't tell whether this book was trying to be a YA romance or it was trying to be a YA coming of age story. It tried to do both, and I think because it tried to do both, it failed at both. Not failed, but it just was lackluster. And for that reason, this book also gets a 2.5 from me. As far as representation goes, there's Haitian American representation, African American with his love interest. There's adoption because his best friend Ming is adopted. He's Chinese. As far as I know, that's the only representation that we see. I may have missed something. When it comes to quality and teaching potential, I would not use this as a book club book, and I would not use this as a whole class novel. As far as as keeping this on the classroom shelves, I probably would. I don't know that I would go out of my way to purchase it or order it, but it might be something that as I'm looking through books and I see that as an option, yeah, I would put on my shelves. Because not everyone wants a high stakes, serious story. Sometimes they want to read about people like them. So for that reason, I would rank it above This Is Not the Jess Show. So for right now, out of these 5 that I've reviewed in this first half of the video, Charming as a Verb ranks 4th. I do not foresee it staying at 4th. I foresee it falling lower, but perhaps staying around the mid-range, or probably like something like 12 to 17, somewhere in there. So next we have the 5 books that I read in the second half of this first part of the project, and I'm going to start that off with This Is My America by Kim Johnson. This is a book that deals with a lot of heavy issues. I appreciated learning that Kim Johnson comes from a social justice background. I believe that she has a background in law. I don't remember that 100%, but the setup in this book is you have Tracy, whose family was uprooted from their home in New Orleans by Katrina and then a subsequent hurricane, and so they moved to Texas. And when they moved to Texas and were trying to get established, there were some things that went down where ultimately a white couple was murdered and Tracy's father was unjustly convicted of the crime, which he did not commit. And Tracy was about 10 years old at that time and has been working for 6 years to try to get him released, to try to get the attention of Innocence X, which is Kim Johnson's version of the Innocence Project, to try to get her father released from prison because he now has less than a year left on his sentence before execution. And at the beginning of the novel, there are events that conspire to entrap her brother in what could end up in a similar situation, because a white girl that Tracy knows, who is on the newspaper with her, is murdered, and her brother's letter jacket is found, and they want her brother, but he runs and he doesn't turn himself into the police. Tracy is now dealing with trying to both free her father before he is wrongfully executed, and also try to make sure that her brother is not wrongfully convicted of murdering this girl, but she doesn't know whether or not he had anything to do with it. She believes that he doesn't, but she doesn't know for sure. And so this book is an investigation sort of framed novel where she's trying to do what she knows, what she believes that the police won't do. And Johnson does an excellent job with this. Yes, it's a little frustrating that she, as a high school junior, is doing these investigations, and at a couple points you're like, wait, she should know better. She's been doing all of this, but there was only a couple points like that, which were good. But there were some really powerful moments with one of her best friends. So she had a best friend whose father was going to go into business with her father, but was also implicated in this murder. But instead of giving himself up, he barricaded himself inside his house, was shot and killed, and so was her friend, this man's son. And while her friend was recovering, there was a kid at their school who stepped in to help her, to protect her from all the bullying and the hate that she was getting. And they become really good friends. And he's always liked her, so there is a little bit of a love triangle between them, but not a ton, and I understand it because they're teenagers. Their hormones are raging. But one of the really impactful parts is Dean, this friend, really reckoning with his own bias that has been structured in him. Like, he knows that his mother is very openly biased and racist, even though his family employs Tracy's mom, but he has to wrestle with, what does this mean for me? What does my reaction, what does my gut reaction that your brother did this, what does that mean? Why did I think, even though I know all this stuff about him, that he would do that, automatically assume that? And he has to reckon with it, and he's really tortured by it inside, and he's really reckoning with it. And at first I was frustrated with Tracy's response because she's not empathetic to him. But then I realized someone who has had those same sorts of struggles that Tracy has had, that is how she will respond. It was very eye-opening to see those perspectives. I love the fact that Johnson showed what it is like for white people to really reckon with racism, implicit bias, systemic racism, family inheritance, things that your ancestors did that was awful, and not wanting to be associated with it. But also the fact that the marginalized, the people that have been oppressed, they don't owe any sympathy towards them. And as I'm talking about this, I'm sort of I think I'm talking myself into perhaps giving this a higher rating. I rated it 4 stars. I'm probably going to bump my rating up to 4 stars, but it's not going to change the overall ranking. So as far as the criteria that I've set for this SCASL project, representation, you definitely have African American. As far as teaching potential and quality, this book is high quality. The problem for me comes with the fact that even though this is so desperately needed in the political climate in which I live, a book like this is going to get all sorts of unjustified hate and aspersions cast on it. And I just don't think that in the particular area in which I live that I could actually use this book for any sort of teaching, even though I think it would be an excellent resource for it. And as far as classroom shelves go, it would be difficult. I've mentioned before the whole deal with my school district trying to make sure that every single book is vetted before it is available to students. And I haven't heard how that's going to apply to teachers like me who don't teach ELA, but have a whole ton of books in their classrooms. But I have a hard time believing that a book like this would make it past the so-called vetting process, which is absolutely gutting because this book needs to be taught and read. And so tentatively, I have it ranked 4th, which is bumping down a few other books. I'll go over the overall ranking of these first 10 books at the end of this video. So I have it ranked as 4th, but it might be tied with the book that I believe I'm going to talk about next. Next, we have Unscripted by Nicole Kronzer. Of the books that I have read specifically for this project, I believe is the best one that I have read, although it's competing almost equally with This Is My America. I did not expect that when I first started reading this book because Unscripted, the main character, Zelda, she loves improv and comedy, and she competes on an improv team at her home with her brother. She's in a blended family where she and her brother, it's complicated and I still don't understand it, but they're a blended family, but they've lived together all their lives. And the bond between her and Will, her brother, is beautiful. They are going for this 2-week improv camp, which is highly reputable. Scouts from different improv theater comedy troupes come to the showcase at the end. Zelda is really trying to get on the varsity team because she wants to go to SNL. She meets 5 other girls who they call the Gildas because they're in Gilda Radner's. That's the name of the cabin. They don't have a counselor because the counselor quit suddenly right before. Now it's a little bit of foreshadowing as it goes in. She meets one of the counselors right away and she sort of has a little crush on him, but she's like, I shouldn't because he's a counselor and he's 20, he's 3 years older than me. It's not cool for like anything to happen in that sort of a relationship. Then she makes it onto varsity, but there are boys in the group who, when they're doing these different exercises, they're doing things that are very misogynistic and sexist, and like she has to play a dead hooker because that's the only thing that she can be. Like every role that they give her is horrible. The counselor, who turns out to be this counselor that she thought was cute, doesn't do anything and she's torn. But then he starts expressing interest in her. And of course she's got voices and in her corner her, telling her, hey, this is not cool. He shouldn't be doing that. Stay away. You really shouldn't do this. And this is becoming really not fun for her. And the book descends sort of into this chronicling of an abuser, how this sort of gets started. And Zelda and this counselor, they never have a relationship, but he feels like he can own her and do certain things to her. And there's never anything that quote unquote crosses a legal line with what he does with her, but it's not, no, should absolutely not happen. And it really traumatizes her. And the way that Nicole Kronzer portrays this, it should open people's eyes to the real ramifications to what this sort of gaslighting and emotional and psychological manipulation can do. It is so well written. This book, it got 4.5 stars for me. There are some things that about it being YA and some typical tropes that happen that weren't necessarily my favorite, which brought it down from 5 stars. But the way that Kronzer handles this is brilliant. As far as rep goes, there is LGBT rep. Her brother is gay. There are a couple of the girls in the cabin are gay. There are some African-American students at the camp, as well as this Boy Scout camp, which is really close, and the Boy Scouts lead these team building exercises for them. So there's a lot of rep in it. There's also an albinism rep. I appreciate it in the author's note where Kronzer goes out of her way to say that she had like Own Voices reviewers check certain things like that to make sure that she was portraying it well. As far as quality and teaching potential goes, this is a really solid book. I would definitely use it, probably not for a whole class novel, but for a book club, for some sort of themed book club, probably dealing with characters, with, I don't even know what the theme itself would be, but there's so much quality to this book that I would want to integrate it and bring students' attention to it somehow. And I would definitely have this on my classroom shelves. Next, we have The Ravens by Danielle Page and Cass Morgan. I do not typically read a lot of dual authors or multiple author books. And even though I couldn't see a distinct difference between the different writing styles, I saw differences in characterization. So there are 2 protagonists in this work, and each chapter alternates between these 2 perspectives. You have Vivi, who is an incoming freshman at this prestigious university where her mother has always told her, don't go there, you shouldn't go there, but she wants to get out of this life where her mother has constantly moved, never been able to set down roots, and her mother makes her living what Vivi thinks as being a fraud, doing tarot readings and etc. And then you have Scarlett, who is basically a legacy student, both sort of a legacy of the university, but also of this sorority that she is part of as a junior. She wants to become the president of the sorority in her junior year. Eventually, obviously, their paths cross, and it is revealed very quickly in the POV of Scarlett that this sorority is actually a front for a coven. They are the most selective sorority, and every single member is a witch. So of course Vivi pledges to this sorority, and there are various things going on. There are problems. There's a terrible secret in Scarlett's past that seems like it's coming back to haunt them in this book. But the thing that I mentioned at the beginning, the difference in the perspectives, the way that each of the characters, specifically Scarlett, the way that Scarlett is portrayed in Scarlett's POV chapters, there's a lot more things where you can empathize with her and you understand. I still don't like her because she seems like an entitled snob. But then in Vivi's perspective, for most of the book, Scarlett comes off as very aloof and there's nothing that you can really empathize with, which felt really disjointing. Then you get to the reveal at the end who the the bad guy in the scenario is, because one of the coven goes missing. I felt like because we were so focused on Vivi and Scarlet, you don't get enough of a perspective of who the villain, quote unquote villain, turns out to be. And it felt like a letdown. Like when it was revealed, like, oh, okay, all right. It wasn't poorly written, but there were enough problems with it for me to not give it a high rating. So I would rate it a 3.5 stars. As far as rep goes, there are some mentions of some queer characters. There are some mentions of characters who are not white, but they're mentioned almost as token representation. So there's not really a lot of representation in here. As far as quality and teaching potential, I would not use this as a book to teach from. I would potentially keep it on my classroom shelves because I think this is the sort of book that is going to appeal to some YA readers. I don't know that I would necessarily go out of my way to get it, but I would rank my preferences sort of for having it on the shelves as higher than other books that I have talked about so far in this first part of the project. Next we have Grown by Tiffany D. Jackson. I knew as soon as I saw this on the list that this would hit hard, and it did. It is a quote-unquote ripped from the headlines story based on everything that came out about the rapper R. Kelly. In this book, the R. Kelly stand-in is Corey Fields. The main character is Enchanted, but she is an aspiring singer. And also she swims. She goes to a predominantly white institution on scholarship, but she goes to this contest where one of the judges is Corey Fields and starts to get special attention and ends up falling into his trap and becoming part of his web and abused both physically and emotionally. I knew it was going to be rough from the opening scene. The opening scene, there's a now and then dual timeline aspect to it, but the now it opens up with Corey being brutally stabbed, having been brutally stabbed, and Enchanted is covered in blood. You know something goes down, and it's the dual timeline weaving closer and closer and closer together, and you're trying to figure out what happens with it. It's a lot. One of the biggest problems for me with the two Tiffany D. Jackson books that I've read thus far is her use of the unreliable narrator. At the end of both of the books that I've read by her, allegedly, and this one, she does something at the end that just sort of makes you go, wait, what? Can I actually believe anything? And I don't want to end a book thinking that way. I don't like the unreliable narrator trope. Also, there was just so much in this book. Do stories like these need to be told? People need to understand these stories? Yes. Is this a book that I could recommend? No. Not because it's poorly written, but because of everything that's in the book. I ultimately rated it 3 stars, and not because of the quality of it, but just because of everything that I've talked about. As far as rep, there's, African American. As far as quality and teaching potential, no. I would not use this book, nor do I think there is any way that any sort of public educational institution would use this book, whether it's from Stigma or what have you. I just don't think it's teaching material. As far as having it on the classroom shelves, no. I would not. I just think there's a lot in there to deal with. I don't think that the young adult audience is mature enough, even though this is sort of directed towards them and is on this list. As far as ranking goes, I do have this ranked 6th. I forgot to mention in the previous clip about the Ravens that I have the Ravens ranked 7th. So I do think that the quality of the writing is better, but I would have the Ravens on the classroom shelf and I would not have Grown on a classroom shelf. The last book that I will talk about in part 1 is Be Dazzled by Ryan LaSala. And yes, the name is a play on bedazzling with rhinestones. The main character, Raphael Odom, is a cosplayer. One of the things that he loves most is designing and crafting the costumes. There's so much artistry that goes into it. I loved those sections where he was talking about his design and the processes going into it. I've always appreciated and enjoyed behind the scenes discussions or videos or things written about the creation of various forms of art. The rest of this book is a romance. It is a young adult queer romance, and I am not a romance reader. I have never really enjoyed romance-centric books. Books with a romance plotline in there, yeah. I've loved some of those, and I've really appreciated the romantic plotline in some of them. There's something about romance being the primary driver in the book that just doesn't do it for me. And that was the thing that really held me back and really tempered my enjoyment of this book. I thought the pacing was good. The structure was good. The characters were fairly well fleshed out, although the secondary characters could have used a little bit more development. You know, the HEA was good because HEA is happily ever after ending, which you have with romances. It had it, which is how I knew it was a romance book. It just wasn't for me. So I ultimately ended up giving this 3.5 stars. As far as rep goes, obviously LGBT. I think there may have been mentions of other ethnicities, but I'm not sure. As far as quality and teaching potential, it's a feel-good read. It's not one that I would use to teach from. And as far as keeping it on the classroom shelves, I don't see any problem with it. Again, I will refer back to the current political environment in which I live. I don't know that this would get past the quote-unquote vetting committee just because it's a queer romance. Who knows with that. And so the ultimate rank that I gave it was 8. So that brings us to the end of part 1. I have read 7 books so far for this project, with 3 previously read to starting this project. My ultimate ranking, I still do not see the top 2 being unseated at all. I've seen the other books that are on this list. Potentially they might, but I don't see that happening. So tied for number 1, we still have Firekeeper's Daughter and Clap When You Land. 3rd, and potentially tied with 4th, I'll go ahead and say it's a tie right now and say Unscripted and This Is My America. And then 5th would be the Gilded Ones. I don't see a lot of shifting happening in the top 5 unless something just wows me. Grown at number 6, The Ravens at number 7, Dazzled at number 8, Charming as a Verb at number 9, and This Is Not the Jess Show at number 10. So at this point, that is the tentative ranking that I have thus far, and we'll see if any of those rankings change when I read the second half of this project.